me just reassure something to you, and that's the fact that there are so many times when things just make sense because I took this church history course. There's things that are happening today, and there's things that people believe the way they believe them, and it all goes down to what we've learned in church history. So I guess I just want you to know that it's not just useless information that we're after here. It's insight. There's some fantastic insight. And here's a good example. You know, we gave you guys some topics to go over for your research paper. There's a small chunk of section where we're going to hit the Muslims. The Muslims in today's world, wouldn't you say, are pretty influential? Don't you want to know where they fit in Revelation chapters 2 and 3? This is what we're talking about. There's a reason why the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, has their hand stamped on so much, and it might not even be their name there, but it's the same religion. It boils down to Revelation 2 and 3. So I just want to encourage you with that as we enter into this, that we're giving you insight here. This isn't just useless history info, because most people, when they think, oh, I got to take a history class. Oh, history is as good as the teacher makes it. I mean, I took a history course in community college, and the teacher was a historian. He was incredible. The substance may not have been all that, but this dude, he might have been lying when he was telling us stories, but he told us some crazy stories, and it made American history interesting for me. Then I had another history course where we just had to literally take a transparency and just copy what the teacher put on there. You guys remember having to do that, the overhead projectors? Yeah. And I just thought, what's the point? That's your typical history class. So this really sheds light on so much. So what was the definition of history we looked at a couple weeks back? How do you define history in a nutshell?
History in the Bible or history?
Yeah, just in general.
God moves and Satan counter moves.
Yeah. There's a threefold plan. God's got a plan for the universe, for the world, for your life. And history is nothing but God fulfilling that plan and Satan countering that plan every time. So we know that the devil's the greatest counterfeit on top of the fact that he counter moves. And then we also saw how the nation of Israel is one of those ancient landmarks that we see as well. Even as we jump into this first church age, all these things that we laid up for the intro, the foundation, I think you'll start to see it. You'll say, man, we're only in the first church age and we're already seeing some of these things come to fruition. So that's what I'm talking about here. So on your notes, it says go to Revelation 2:1. I want to just jump into the first one. That way we can feel like we got somewhere, because we're supposed to actually finish this tonight. But we're not going to get through all these pages tonight. No way. So, let's go to Revelation 2. And then why don't somebody just open us in prayer and just ask God to shed the light so that we can spread it.
Dear God, thank you for tonight. Thank you that you are able to come and speak to everything. I pray as we enter the class tonight that you just make the history come alive, what they were talking about. Just make it jump off the page for us so that we can really learn it and learn from it. So everything coming out.
Okay, Revelation 2:1-7. Somebody go ahead and read those first 7 verses.
Unto the angel of the church of Ephesus write, these things saith he that holdeth the 7 stars in his right hand, who walketh in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. I know thy works, and thy labor, and thy patience, and how thou canst not bear them which are evil, and thou hast tried them, which say they are apostles, and are not, and hast found them liars, and hast bore and hast patience, and for my name's sake hast labored, and hast not fainted. Nevertheless I have somewhat against thee, because thou hast left thy first love. Remember therefore from whence thou art fallen, and repent, and do the first work. Or else I will come unto thee quickly, and I will remove thy candlestick out of his place, except thou repent. But this thou hast thou hast, that thou hatest the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. To him that overcometh will I give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God.
Okay, so those 7 verses entail this first church, and the name is the Church of Ephesus. And here's the definition of what Ephesus means. We're going to look at the definition of each church of each specific age. And historically, keep in mind here that every passage in Scripture has the historical, a doctrinal, and then a practical application. So historically, I want you to know, this was a real church in Paul's time. He actually established the Church of Ephesus. If you go back to like Acts 20, 18 through 20 is where you'll see that in history. And I think Timothy was even the pastor of it at one point. Paul founded it. Timothy was the pastor of it. So this was a historical church, and it actually was a part of fulfilling the Great Commission in the book of Acts. That's why I believe the name means fully purposed. They're the ones that turned the world upside down, if you remember that passage in the book of Acts. It was because of the Church of Ephesus during this time frame. Because this, if you look at the time period, what's it say in your box there? The time period of this church age.
33 through 280.
So roughly right after Christ died, up to 200 AD is the time frame for this first church age. Okay? By the time we get to the 7th church age, we're going to be at the year 2000. You see the direction we're headed? So this is a prophetical view of 7 church ages within the last 2,000 years. That's what we've already talked about. Now, your next blank here is that even though the Great Commission had been fulfilled, right? You're reading the book of Acts and people are getting saved left and right. It's exciting. It's Bible times. You see God move, you see Satan move. Now, here's your blank. We will also begin to see a leavening take place. What does that leavening in the scriptures imply? We've talked about this before. When there's a leavening, what do you think of?
Rotting away, or like just a bad apple.
Well, what's a leaven for? Yeast, leaven. It makes what rise? Makes the dough rise. So in the Bible, leaven represents 2 things. It's never good. It's either sin or it's bad doctrine. One of the 2. So we're going to start to see just that little bit of leaven start to rise. And we'll get to this here in a little bit, but this is part of the intro of this church age, is that it's not all good. And Heather, you just read about it. There are some things God had to address with this specific church age. So this is a very important period. Everything that's right starts here. Everything that's wrong in the church today starts here. It's foundational. So I think that's why we couldn't just spend 1 week on this first church age. We need to make sure that we go through this, take our time, and if you have any questions, if you miss something, make sure you get my attention so we can get some understanding here. So a basic outline of this would be to look at their works, their loss, and then their church fathers. The church fathers is the name of the men, the influential men, whether they were good men or bad men, that have influenced church history. Some of these names, you're like, oh yeah, I've heard of him. So we're going to look at these 3, and my guess is next week is we'll look at the church fathers. But let's start off with the works. And this is where God commends them, right? He had some positive things to say about them. And the first one was this. It was the fact that they couldn't stand liars. He points that out right there in verse 2. He says, man, I know that you guys have works, you're patient, you've tried them which say they're apostles and they're not, and you found them to be liars. So they couldn't stand liars, and that's a good thing. There's actually a lot of churches that tolerate that. But specifically, if you look at who these liars were, he's talking about some false apostles. And we're gonna talk about a phrase called apostolic succession. It's where the doctrine, where a church would believe that Peter, when Jesus gave him this authority in Matthew 16, that he was the very first pope. And because of him, he passes that succession on. that not going?
No, it's going, but we had moved it for Mike to do the
Oh,
TV.
okay.
So now it's showing the whiteboard.
So these specific liars would be the ones who, they like to claim Israel's promises. Remember how we talked about Israel being an ancient landmark? They're the ones who claim Israel as their land. We're going to see how Rome tries to steal that. So that's all right here in verse 2, but notice what he says about them is that they proved all things. It says in 1 Thessalonians 5:21, we're to prove all things. This was a church that didn't believe everything they heard. That's a good thing. I read this, I'm like, it kind of reminds me of our church. I feel like we've learned to prove all things. We don't lay our hands on people real quick. We don't get easily impressed. There's some churches that, oh man, that guy can speak eloquent. And he'll use all kinds of large words, and he might spout a little Greek and Hebrew at the time, and people are just like, wow, that guy's eloquent, and he's got an intellect. Well, God don't care about that stuff. And neither did this church right here. So they proved all things. They were aware of Satan's counterfeit tactics, right? Because who's the most Christ-like character in history? Think about that. Christ-like. That's the devil. Yeah. We say, be Christ-like. Be careful. That's the devil right there. Be Christ. Okay? So they were aware of Satan's counterfeit tactics. And so, in essence, right away we see God commend this church for their hatred of evil. And then we saw in verse 2 that they tried these false apostles and got rid of them. That's great. Paul in 1 Corinthians 11, that's actually 2 Corinthians 11, that's an example. What he did in 2 Corinthians 11, I don't know if you remember that passage, but that's where these false apostles were challenging Paul's authority. So he has to lay it up and just say, guys, call me a fool, but I'm just telling you, I've got the credentials of an apostle. I've suffered for the Lord Jesus Christ. I've got fruit. These guys, let me just remind you, Satan transforms himself into an angel of light. That's these guys. Paul has to tell them that. So this church in Ephesus, they've tried these false apostles. They see these things. And then, of course, your next point here is that, like today, in this first church age, there were charismatics claiming to have apostolic gifts. So we're going to look at who these liars were in this period towards the end of your notes. You'll clearly see who they are. Now, not only could they not stand liars, they were also, the two blanks is this, a working and then a laboring church. Notice he uses both of those words, working and laboring. They were hard workers. They knew how to sweat, man. If anybody could work, it was the church of Ephesus. Once again, kind of reminds me a little of our church. I'm like, oh, we got some good, solid workers. Not just that, but laborers. People willing to sweat. And it even says that they didn't faint. He says, you guys, you've not grown weak and weary in well-doing. I'm proud of you. You're standing strong. He's commending them. And that's actually a good thing because sometimes when it gets tedious, what do you want to do? Well, you want to throw in the towel. But we keep sowing. And that's exactly what this church did. And I believe that's actually one main reason why Christianity establishes itself as a force throughout Asia. That's why we see what happened with the book of Acts. Because they were workers, they were laborers. They didn't quit. So great things happening. When we get to the negative on this is what everybody focuses on. But let's make sure that we're not missing out the positive. Because look at verse 3. He says, thou hast borne and hast patience for my name's sake. So your third blank here is that they had patience. I mean, think about it. Knowing that the world wouldn't be converted in one night, it's going to require a little bit of patience. And in ministry, we know this. We know that we can't have fruit overnight. And guys, tell me, what comes with patience? Yeah, that's actually patience on steroids. That's another way to put it. It involves suffering. It even tells us, somebody grab Romans 5:3. Just read what that says. I think we tend to forget about this sometimes, but when we want fruit, it's going to demand patience. And in order to have patience, you've got to go through what this verse says.
Not only so, but we glory in tribulations also, knowing that tribulation worketh patience.
Yeah, tribulation worketh patience. That's just a part of it. Too many people want the quick results without having to suffer, without having to go through the tribulation. But that's not how it works. In order to have life, there's got to be death. That's a principle in general. So Romans 5:3 is a great reference for that man, patience results from trials. And when he says, thou hast borne, he's saying, in other words, you guys have endured suffering. Have you guys started the trail of blood? Surely by now, you guys have. I don't know if you recall, but just in the first few pages, the first couple hundred years, you already see some major suffering take place. So what I would like to do is, I'll have somebody read this list here in a second of just some of the men in the Bible that are included in this first century. But who's read the book called Fox's Book of Martyrs? Have you guys heard of that book?
I think you
I've read-
talked about it.
I've read some of it.
Yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
resource. If we didn't have this Trail of Blood, I would have had you guys read that, because that goes hand in hand. What he does is he lists, just within the last 2,000 years, beginning with these men on this list on our sheet, the men who have shed their blood in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. And the Catholics sure aren't going to mention it. So this book is a gold mine. And I would highly recommend you read it. But Fox's Book of Martyrs, actually, he gives a very vivid description of the suffering that took place in the lives, even beginning in the first 2 centuries. But put down in this blank here that these people below were all men who were taking the gospel to the whole world. And when I say to the whole world, we're talking India, Egypt, Persia, Europe. That's what it was. They were taking the gospel across the world. So why don't somebody read, just go through this list, and you're going to recognize some of these names, and you might be like, oh, I didn't know that's how he died. But go ahead and take a gander, and I don't care who reads it.
Stephen stoned, James of Zebedee beheaded, Philip scourged, thrown in prison and crucified, Matthew slain by a sword in Ethiopia, James the Lord's brother beaten to death,
94 years old.
Matthias stoned to death, then beheaded, Andrew crucified, continued to preach to enemies while on the cross, Mark dragged through the streets to pieces in Alexandria, Egypt, Peter, tradition says he was crucified upside down, Paul tortured, then beheaded, sadly gave his neck, Jude martyred, Bartholomew and Nathaniel, cruelly beaten and crucified, delayed to death by a whip, Thomas roughed by a spear in India, Luke hanged on an olive tree in Greece, Simon the Zealot crucified, John the Beloved cast into a cauldron of boiling oil, miraculously delivered, then exiled to Patmos, Barnabas stoned to death, countless other Christians martyred.
And can you see why it was so scary in this time frame to become a Christian? And there's actually, as you know, Taylor, you've been in other countries like this, where it's hostile to become a Christian, where it's very similar as if they're in Bible times. So we've seen, these were just a small handful of the first generation of disciples. And this was the price they paid. And yet the Bible does say that there's a special crown reserved for them, for these specific people. But now, half of these were from Fox's Book of Martyrs, and he goes by really what the historians and traditionalists have said. There's no reason to think they're lying about this stuff. Especially when we're going to see and read more and more about the accounts of the bloodshed. So when it says countless other early Christians were martyred, look at the 3 subpoints underneath that. One thing that they were accused of, believe it or not, would have been atheism. Why? Because they didn't worship images. Because they refused to worship images, you know what the word atheist means. What's the A mean? You put an A in front of something, it negates it. It means no. right? Like amillennialism, it means there is no real millennium. So theism, you guys know what that means?
Like doctrine, like the Bible.
God. That's how you get the word atheism, atheist. So when somebody says, I'm an atheist, they'll sit there and claim they don't believe that there is a God, which 9 times out of 10, that they're full of BS. However, there does get to that point in time where their heart is so seared that they really do believe that. So these were the guys who were accused of that, but it wasn't because they didn't believe in the one true God. It's because they didn't believe in the idols, which was everybody else's God. Isn't that crazy how the devil works like that? So they were martyred because of that. The same people who turned into cannibalists, the Roman Catholic Church, they accused these martyrs of cannibalism because they ate the flesh and drank the blood of Jesus. That's what they said. You guys know the passage in John chapter 6,
Yeah.
where Jesus says, by you eating my flesh and drinking my blood, you're partaking of me. Well, was Jesus talking about his literal flesh and literal blood? No.
No.
He even says later on in that chapter, it's spiritual what he's talking about. Well, these Christians knew that, but the enemies were mocking them, making fun of them, saying that you guys are cannibalists, you're eating the blood of Christ, or you're drinking the blood of Christ, eating his body. They're finding anything they can do to twist the context and find a reason to slaughter them. The next one, accused of treason against the Roman Empire because they refused to worship Caesar. Of course, Rome is still pagan at this time. You're going to notice a phrase that we use quite a bit, but it goes from pagan Rome to papal. That basically means with the popes, religious. So it goes from secular to religious. Right now, we're still dealing with what's called pagan Rome. It was the Roman Empire. As you can see, it was very secular. Anybody who even claimed to be a Christian at the point in time was persecuted. If you were affiliated with Christ, or even the Jews. We're going to start to see that shift into this kind of Rome, and that shows the devil's subtlety. If the devil can't get you from the outside, he'll come from within. And this is where the real bloodshed takes place. So we'll start to see that coming up. But by the time we get to the 3rd and 4th church age, this is out of control. This led to severe persecution in the first 2 centuries under the first 4 Roman emperors. And you can see these names, Nero, Domitian, Trajan, and then Marcus Aurelius. And I put down key men that were actually put to death under these people's aid. Like, for instance, Paul. He died under Nero. I don't know if you remember, but Nero is that guy that he set Rome on fire and blamed the Christians for it. It wasn't proven that he did that, but that's what tradition says. And as wicked as he was, why would we doubt that would be true? So to set his own city on fire and then to blame the Christians, wow, that's pretty bold. But that was Nero. Domitian was the one who had John boiled, and then miraculously God delivered him, and then he was exiled, and then that's where he wrote Revelation. So that was under Domitian. John was the last apostle to live, by the way. In fact, he was the last writer of our scriptures. This book got finished writing. Anybody know what year that would have been? 90 AD. Revelation would have been the last book, 90 AD. So John was the man for that. And we'll have a little side note on that here in a moment. But then this Trajan, there's a guy named Ignatius. He was the pastor of the Antioch church. Remember the good model church in the book of Acts? Mm-hmm. The pastor of this church was the one who was martyred under his reign. And then Polycarp, we'll see who this guy is next week. He was actually John the Apostle's disciple. I don't know if you've ever heard of his name, but he's the one that died under Marcus Aurelius. So, John Fox from Fox's Book of Martyrs said this: "This persecution rather increased than diminished the spirit of Christianity." Ain't that something? You'd think all that persecution would squelch it and put it to death. Kind of reminds me of that passage at the beginning of Exodus where it says Joseph died off, so Israel started multiplying while they were in Egypt, and it said the more Pharaoh and the taskmasters afflicted them, the more they began to multiply. Guys, that's how it works. And I can't tell you how many times I read articles from Voice of the Martyrs, that magazine, and there's martyrs still in this nation, or in other nations today, and they say the same thing. When the persecution got more intense, we started spreading and making more disciples. It's the Acts 8:1 principle. If you're not going to do Acts 1:8, then God's going to cause persecution, and it's going to make Acts 8:1 take place. And that's where we spread. And God's just strategically doing his thing. So in essence, I love this quote here. Somebody read that quote by Francis Chan. It's a little bit down.
Oh, okay. Christians are like manure, spread them out, and they help everything grow better. But keep them in one big pile, and they stink horrible.
Would you agree with that? Well, let me say, would the Lord agree with that, you think? I mean, think about the Tower of Babel. When they had a commission to do, and they refused to do it, they said, nope, we're going to come together. All in the name of the Lord. And God says, I'm not pleased with that. You guys stink. So I do like that quote a lot. Now your blank here would be the fact that the gospel spread mightily during this time of hard persecution. Right? Because these were missionaries who were being killed. And the more they were afflicted, the more they multiplied and grew. So it was God that used that persecution to actually spread the gospel to the world. And part of what you read in the book of Acts shows this taking place. There's a note towards the bottom of this. It says, many of these martyrs had such amazing courage that several pagans became converts. And guys, I believe that I think that's happened every century, beginning right here in this century. I don't know if you've ever read the biography of Richard Warburton, but he was the one who was put into that communist prison back in the 60s in Romania. And do you think Adolf Hitler was bad? You think that whole Nazi regime was bad? Check out the extreme communists and the stuff that they would do to torture the Christians there. He gives some accounts, but what I love reading about it is when he would win one of his torturers to Christ. And there's countless stories of that taking place. And that's actually what happened right here. Well, that's what patience over there. Remember how we read about patience in Revelation 2? They had patience. So that's one good thing about going through those afflictions, because it gives you the patience to be able to look somebody in the eye who just slaughtered your child and say that Jesus loves you. You can repent from your sin. And many a times you'd find out, I'm just talking modern stories that I've read, where the persecutor would just look at the person and say, I don't know how you could have the audacity to say that to me. I want your God. To have that kind of love to where it leaves the persecutor speechless. So that's what we're talking about here, and this is the kind of things that we see. Well, patience. Patience is a much stronger word than we realize. So when we say that they had patience in Revelation 2:3, that's what it took to begin to win the world. Now, notice this next one that says about them in verse 6. Wow. Is that you, Lord?
Yeah. AB's word name.
Notice he said that thou hast one thing in verse 6, and that's the fact that thou hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans. And then God says this. And by the way, I hate them too. You guys remember who these Nicolaitans are? We've talked about these guys before. You probably heard Mike from the pulpit say something about them. Anybody remember off the top of your head?
Are they Greeks?
No, not necessarily. A lot of them were Romans. Their name means this: a conqueror of laity. Conqueror of laity. I didn't say a spiritual ruler, I said a conqueror. So, who's the laity? What's a laity? It's a layman. Who's a layman? When you hear the word layman, you got the pastors, then you got the layman. Common people, yeah. So a common, ordinary man. So do you see who a Nicolaitan is? It's someone who likes to conquer. A common, ordinary man. You guys know any Nicolaitans out there? Well, we see even back in the very first century, there's this group, they're conquerors of the common people, and it generally begins with education. If you've got a superior education, then it means immediately you're at a higher class level. And so today, believe it or not, we still see this system working in churches. Not only will we see it in history through the Roman Catholic Church, there's even I've seen Bible-believing churches operate with it. I've seen King James churches, literally, where the pastor, he tries to lord his flock. That's a Nicolaitan setup. It's the same thing, even though they might be fooling themselves. And think about it. What is it that really is at the root of Nicolaitan? Pride and insecurity. To be that insecure that you have to try to lord over other people. So that's really what we're dealing with. Now, in the big picture, if you want the context of history, we're talking about the Roman Catholic Church. We'll get to that here in a second. But your blank was conqueror of laity. And if you look at verse 15, somebody to read verse 15 in the same chapter.
Revelation 2:15.
Mm-hmm.
So hast thou also them that hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate.
So you see that it was even called a doctrine. It was a doctrine of how to conquer the common people. Isn't that interesting? That's even called a doctrine here. Yeah, the devil's pretty slick. A couple notes under this. These are things I think we know, but it's important to, since we're talking this, to have down, especially in your notes. And that's the fact of this: there is no special priest class or a special position today. 1 Peter 5:3 makes it very clear we're not to lord the flock. He's the chief shepherd. In fact, here's your blank here. Every Christian is anointed. That verse in 1 Peter 2:5 is one of the best verses to go to, especially if you're dealing with a Roman Catholic. And it says this: ye also as lively stones. Hey, that's what Jesus called Peter. A stone just like you and me. Nothing special about Peter. He says, ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house and holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. So we know that we also are priests. But the difference between us and the Old Testament priests is what? What's the word he uses there in verse 5? Is it a physical priesthood? No.
Holy priesthood.
It's holy and it's spiritual. It's spiritual sacrifices. Spiritual priesthood. We don't do physical sacrifices, right? I mean, if we're going to be like the Catholics and try to do it the way that they did it in the Old Testament, then let's be consistent and do it all the way. How many of those things were actually commanded in the ceremonial law? There's over 300. So the point is this: we're all priests. It's all spiritual. Because Christ is in us, there's direct access to God's Father. Doesn't take any special class or takes no priest at a church, no preacher. It just takes a Christian, somebody who has Christ on the inside. So these are just basic things, but guys, that verse is what makes one-on-one discipleship so powerful. When you take that to other countries, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because when we go to like Belize or Africa or India, some of these nations where this philosophy of one-on-one discipleship is so new to them, it takes a long time to ingrain it within their culture because they're so used to having this Nicolaitan system where there's one person who's better and more superior than everybody else. There are a lot of countries that still operate this way. And when you can instill one-on-one discipleship, and a common man like you, Taylor, goes into Pakistan, and they're looking at you like, you're not a preacher? You're not a pastor? No, I'm actually a police officer. And yet you're sitting down one-on-one making a huge difference. And that's healthy. That's what it's supposed to be. I think that's always been the strength of our church, with our discipleship ministry. And if we can continue to be biblical with that approach, then wow. Does it take time? Absolutely. It takes patience. We know that. But that's the key right there is every Christian being anointed and every Christian is involved in making disciples, not just a certain special class. So all believers are encouraged to study the scriptures. We know these things. There's even verses that back that up right there. It's not just the leaders, every believer. Now, of course, we're supposed to be leading the opposite of the way that the Nicolaitans lead. That passage in Matthew 20 is where Jesus is saying, basically, hey, the true leader is one who serves. That's the true leader. So the first official gathering that we're going to find, it'll be actually be 2 church ages later. It's going to be what's called the Council of Nicaea. It takes place in 325 AD, but that's going to be the first official gathering of this Nicolaitan doctrine, and that'll be under Constantine. We're going to see some crazy things take place there. So are you with me so far? These are some of the good things that God has commended this church for. Great church. I mean, after all, they're the ones who actually got the gospel spread through Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and really the uttermost. I mean, you can almost say, wow, well done, guys. Before we get to their loss, there's an important note here. Put down in your blank that during this period was when the canon of the Bible was actually completed. Not only was it completed, but it was established as well. It would have been completed around 80, 90. Remember how I told you that John was the last one? Mm-hmm. He was the last writer of the scriptures, and he completed it in 80, 90. It wasn't until between 150 and 170, which is still in this church age, when we find it was finally compiled together as the scriptures. God used saved believers, these early church fathers, to bring us to that. And when we're going to take a class called Manuscript Evidence, you're going to see how that whole thing is put together by God's divine hand. So that word canon, just so you guys are all on the same page, anybody know what that means? That's a word you're going to see every now and then. You know, you shoot cannon. Think of it like this. Think of it as a ruler or a standard, like a measuring stick. That's what that word canon means. So when we say the canon of the Bible, the measure of what the Bible consists of. Like the Catholic Church, they've got a different canon for their Bible. Why? Well, because they've got extra books they've added on that aren't divinely inspired. So the canon of their Bible is jacked up. So that's why we say the word canon. The canon of the Bible was established during this church age. Make sense? Look at these notes underneath here. God did use Christians, which would be the royal priesthood, we just read about it in Peter, to preserve his word given in the writings of the New Testament, same way that he used those Levitical priesthoods to preserve the Old Testament. Once again, that's going to be detailed in the Manuscript Evidence class. Unfortunately, as we start to enter the negative, during this church age of Ephesus, we're going to start seeing equal authority was given to some of the writings of the church fathers. Now, do you remember one of the principles we looked at in church history? Satan's good at using dual authorities. Anything with two heads is a monster. Satan's good at really messing up people's homes because of that. So we're going to start seeing how he even used some of the sayings of these early church fathers. They got equal authority as the scriptures. Boy, it's the little seeds of leaven like that that start making a big difference. Last point under here. Our Bible has not only produced more martyrs for sound doctrine than victims of all wars together, it's responsible for the largest missionary movement in church history. And what church age would that have been, if you had to take a guess? Of the 7 church ages. Philadelphia. And that's actually the one where we're going to see our Bible got published, the King James Bible in 1611. So when we get to that, I think you're really going to be like, my goodness, this makes so much more sense to me. Pretty eye-opening. So let's hit some of their bad news now. This is called their loss or their condemnation. Right? They had sound doctrine. They were hardworking. They labored for Jesus' name. It even says that. But here's their problem. Somebody read verse 4. This is convicting, man. Read verse 4.
Nevertheless, I have somewhat against thee, because thou hast left my first love.
And that's your blank. They left their first love. Now, notice something. This is interesting. It says in verse 2, in verse 3, on the commendation it says, and thou hast patience, and for my name's sake thou hast labored. Notice it was God's name's sake, and they labored hard for his name's sake. But I want you to remember something, and I think I put it next to your point here. It says in Psalms 138 that thou hast magnified thy word above all thy name. There's one area that they placed value over the other, and it was the opposite of God. God places his word even above his name. They labored for what? His name. I caught that actually the other day. I'm like, that's interesting. They didn't labor for his word. They labored for his name's sake. God's word is magnified even above his name. So here's what they left. First of all, and guys, this is practical application for you and me today. One, the personal relationship with Christ was on the back burner. We know what that's like. We get too busy. We can even be too busy ministering. You get so busy doing the right things you're supposed to be doing that we neglect what's most important. I can't tell you how many times the Lord has had to take me back to this verse and say, son, you've left your first love. Make the main thing the main thing. It's not about what you're doing. It's about who you are and who I am. So Luke 10:20 is a great cross-reference. That's when, that's actually what Jesus tells the 70. Remember the 70? They're fired up. They're excited. They're like, man, we're casting out demons left and right. Look what we're doing. And Jesus looks up and says, what could he do? He says, you know what? I beheld Satan fall from heaven. Then he says this, don't get fired up and excited about the fact that you can do these things. Be fired up that you're making reasons of life. If you're going to be excited about something, may it be that you know me. Relationship. Samuel's husband said the same thing. Or Hannah's husband in 1 Samuel 1. Remember what she said? What he said? She's so frustrated that she can't have fruit. And finally he just looks at her and says, am I not more important to you than fruit? We're crying out loud here. So put down in your blank that doing the work of ministry aside from Jesus is pointless. It's kind of like the whole Mary and Martha syndrome, what Jesus had to tell Mary and Martha. He's like, hey Martha, don't be too labored, because what Mary's doing, she's sitting on my feet. She's gleaning, she's enjoying. Make it about the relationship. Don't forget about what's most important. And it's easy for us to be Marthas. We get distracted. We're so busy laboring for the Lord, because this was a good church. And yet, they did leave their first love. And so what happens next, and part of leaving their first love, this church began to use words and concepts not found in the Bible. And by the way, to love Christ is to love his word. Because even though one's a lowercase w and one's a capital W, the word is the word. And that's just a concept you can't get away from. Not only is this the written word, but it's also the mind of Christ. So when we say that it's lifted up above its very name, it puts priority right here. To love Christ is to love his word, in essence. So what we see happening, notice, we put this didn't happen overnight. There was words such as like Eucharist. Have you heard that word? For the Lord's table. That's pretty common in the Roman Catholic Church. Is that in your Bible? And here's, don't get me wrong, it's not wrong to use a word that's not in the Bible. I've seen some people take that way too far. If you're going to go that far, then we can't use the word rapture, because rapture's not in the Bible. But when you start making something a doctrine that's not in the Bible, now we got issues. And that's exactly what started taking place during this first church age. So it wasn't something that happened overnight. However, here's the caution that took place. great men of God, they weren't completely faithful to God's word. Just like today, I have a lot of good men that I respect, Bible-believing men, and yet they can be just as guilty as privately interpreting the word as I can. There's a principle of this, you've probably heard this before. Great men aren't always wise. Just because someone's influential and great, and God's used them mightily, doesn't mean that they're infallible. So what started happening during this first church age was some of these church fathers, people started equating what they were saying with the Word of God. That's a big issue. It's a big problem. Here's your next blank. These slight deviations, they will eventually be the foundation of lies used by Satan to counterfeit this religious system. And that's where we get the idea that when you change God's words, you change any words, really what it does is it subtly changes the meaning. It starts to change the meanings behind it. And there's a pretty big absence of Bible words today in general. There's a lot of words that are being left out. And I think that's something that we need to just be aware of. I'm not even talking about modern translations. You can get into that and be like, whoa, 64,000 words left out in this edition? Yeah. Seriously, I mean, I do believe that's why we do have 3 warnings in Scripture, one in the beginning, one in the middle, and one in the very end, that warns us not to tamper with His words. Don't add, don't take away. Don't change, period. To me, that alone is enough to not do that. But regardless, we start seeing that taking place here in the early church. And go back to the garden. Genesis 3:6, one word change, the entire course of human history. Added one word, and look at us today. So when you're dealing with something foundational, it affects everything after it. That's why we're still looking at, wow, this is the very first church age, and we're seeing this take place. Who knows what 1 Corinthians 5:9 says? Yeah, so put the word little there. Of course, the context in that is regarding sin. Yeah, that's where he's saying, man, there's some sin going on in the church, and the problem is you guys have no concern for it. Well, the issue is this, is the tiny bit of that leaven that's not dealt with is going to make that entire bread wise. That's how powerful and contaminating sin can be. That's why leprosy was dealt with so seriously, harshly back in the law, because it was so contagious, and it spread like wildfire. It's the same principle here. So that's what we're seeing taking place. That's part of their loss. Now, in order for them to leave their first love, there is another love that eventually had to take its place, right? So what were some of these things? We've got about 5 minutes. Let's get through this first half. And then I think that'll help us pick up next time where we're at. So the next love that took its place, no surprise, the first one's going to be the love of money. We know that the love of money is actually the root of all evil. The love of money, there is a reason that God says it's the root of all evil. Judas Iscariot, he betrayed the Lord Jesus Christ with what? Money. We find out even the written word, not just the incarnate word was betrayed, but it's the written word also. What's behind all these modern translations? Money. It's really a money issue. So 1 Peter 5:2, a lot of even career pastors, what are they doing it for? Well, it's for the money. So there's no coincidence that we're going to see love of money. But put down in your next one that another love would have been for the church and its ceremonies. The love of the church and ceremonies. In the Trail of Blood, the booklet that we're going through, he starts talking about baptismal regeneration and how in this early church age, it starts to infiltrate. They start to say that, well, you know what, baptism was pretty important. In fact, we think it's so important, and the Bible says so much about it, that I think it's a part of your salvation. And that's the conclusion they came to. You guys remember reading that? And then it got to the point, what was next? Infant baptism. They they start claiming that, well, maybe we better get this child baptized as well at an early age. Guys, this is before the Roman Catholic Church is even established yet. So we're seeing these major doctrines taking place all because these church fathers have left their first love. And their words are being equated now with the Holy Scriptures. I mean, Satan's at work. When do you see some of these guys who they were and how they are worshipped? So the love of the church and ceremonies, and at the time there was no mass, no statues of saints, no purgatory, no popes, none of that yet. And this is already the foundation of what we're getting to. This last blank here under the other love, put down authority. The love of authority. That goes with the Nicolaitan concept. Lording God's flock, right? Conquering that common person. 3 John 9 is another good cross-reference on your sheet there. That it's basically forcing that common man to have to depend upon that priest. You depend on me, son, and you'll be all right. And that kept the scriptures away from the common person. Not the way that God intended it to be. Of course, I've mentioned this word, but that word apostolic succession, Simon Peter is your blank here. Many would actually claim apostolic succession from Simon Peter. Somebody grab Matthew 16:18 and read that real quick. Matthew 16:18. This is a key verse in church history. Key verse.
And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it.
Yeah, that's Jesus talking to Peter. He says, upon this rock, and he's pointing to himself, I will build my church. Of course, this system that we're going to see get established and set up, they claim that Peter was that rock, when his name actually doesn't mean that. It means little rock. So many who have claimed this apostolic succession, they're going to be elected as popes. It's this whole papal system as it transitions from pagan Rome to papal Rome. We talked about that earlier. That's where a lot of this originates. And what they do, if you look on your sheet here, is they claim they can trace their bishops back to Peter. And guys, even if they could, big deal. Right? Who cares? If anything, you could use this. If you're ever dealing with someone like that, just say, okay, just say you could trace it back to Peter, which you can't. But if you did, that means your church was founded on Satan. It's just like 3 verses later, Jesus calls Peter Satan. What are they going to say to that? You know, it just leaves them speechless. It's ridiculous regardless. You could even say that Peter was married. Hello, I thought that popes weren't allowed to be married. So it's just ridiculous, but yet it's crazy how much people buy into that. It goes to show how powerful the devil through the subtleties can be. So this perversion has caused the death of some of our up-and-coming believers in church history. Some of these names you probably read about in the Trail of Blood, the Waldenses, the Huguenots, the Anabaptists. A lot of that is simply because these men, they said, we're not submitting to these guys. There is no true apostolic succession. It goes back to the fact that I'm a priest, just like you're a priest, because we got Christ in us. It's been so perverted, and you still see effects of that today. Not just here in the Catholic Church, but even in other countries. Even that caste system. You go to Eastern Asia, that caste system is wicked. And it's sad. If you're born into it on the lowest level, it's like hell on earth for you. Can you imagine these guys not getting the gospel? So they have hell on earth, then they've got hell for eternity. That's why there's a need for missions, guys. So we need to wrap this up. What happens here, this last point, because they love authority, they instill fear in people. So they'll invent sacraments, anything they can invent to keep power is what they do. And this is manipulation. Because they're insecure. They want power. So what happens is they wind up becoming the authority even over the scriptures. So I think we need to end there because one one more negative thing we'll see, and then we'll look at who the church fathers were, some of the good guys and some of the bad guys. So any questions?